Amara Simmons walked into the courtroom with a quiet confidence, her military uniform sharp and immaculate. As it always was, she had served her country with distinction for over a decade, working tirelessly to bring about change within the military's rigid structures. Amara had become an influential figure in advocating for racial equality and justice reform, both within the armed forces and in society at large. Yet today, none of that mattered in the eyes of the law. The courtroom was quiet, save for the shuffle of papers and the low murmur of attorneys conferring. The judge, Nathaniel Brooks, an older man with a history of serving in the judicial system, sat high above the proceedings, his face unreadable as he glanced down at the case before him. He had presided over countless hearings, most involving minor infractions or routine cases. But this one felt different. Amara was here on what appeared to be a trivial matter, a parking violation. But for reasons unknown to her, the situation had spiraled into something much larger. The charge seemed petty, yet Amara's fine, far steeper than the usual, raised her concern. She had done nothing that warranted this kind of treatment. She wasn't a repeat offender or a person of criminal background. She had served her community with honor and integrity for years. Her mind raced as she sat in the gallery, trying to make sense of the decision. Judge Brooks didn't know her name beyond what was written on the case file. To him, Amara was simply another case, a woman who had parked in the wrong spot at the wrong time. The judge's gavel came down with a sharp crack as he announced the fine. The amount was an astonishing sum, one that far exceeded the standard for this kind of offense. His tone was curt and dismissive. He had made his decision, and that was final. As the courtroom session came to a close, Amara stood, taking a deep breath before walking out. The feeling of injustice gnawed at her insides, but she refused to let it show. She was no stranger to the prejudices that existed in the world. She had faced them time and time again, first as a child, then as a young woman climbing the ranks in the military, and later as a vocal advocate for the very reforms that would soon challenge the status quo. But this felt different. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed around, eager to speak with her. Amara paused briefly, recognizing that her name might soon be in the headlines, but for all the wrong reasons. Despite the weight of the fine and the injustice she felt, Amara was determined to remain composed. What she didn't know yet was that this seemingly insignificant encounter with the law was the beginning of something far greater, a test of her resilience, a challenge to the systems she had spent years fighting against. The fine was just the spark. The fire that would ignite the next chapter of her life was yet to come. Amara Simmons had always known that the road to success was never going to be easy, especially for someone like her. Raised in a small, predominantly black neighborhood in St. Louis, she grew up in a world where opportunity was scarce, and the systemic inequalities that plagued her community were glaringly obvious. Her parents, both hardworking professionals, did their best to instill in her a sense of pride and resilience, but they couldn't shield her from the harsh realities of the world outside their home. As a young girl, Amara was acutely aware of the expectations placed on her because of her race. She had been told by teachers that she was too loud or too ambitious, as if her intelligence and drive were somehow seen as a threat. But Amara, unlike many of her peers, wasn't content to accept the world as it was. She understood that change would require more than just personal perseverance. It would require a broader shift in the way society viewed people like her. From an early age, Amara dreamed of joining the military. It wasn't just about serving her country. It was about changing the system from within. She believed that the military, with its vast structure and power, could be a powerful tool for fostering racial equality and reforming outdated attitudes. Her resolve was strengthened by the stories of black soldiers who had fought in wars long before her, despite the discrimination they faced. She admired their courage, their persistence, and their ability to effect change even in the face of injustice. After high school, Amara was accepted into the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, an opportunity few from her neighborhood ever got. It was here that she would face her first major challenge. The environment at West Point was competitive, intense, and overwhelmingly white. As one of only a few black cadets, Amara was often subjected to subtle racism and exclusion. Yet she excelled academically and physically, determined not to let her race define her limits. By the time she graduated with honors, Amara had become not just a military officer, but an advocate for reform within the institution. She spearheaded initiatives aimed at increasing diversity in military leadership and pushed for policies that addressed racial inequality within the ranks. Her efforts were groundbreaking, but they were also met with resistance. Some of her peers and superiors saw her as too outspoken, too willing to challenge the status quo. Amara's time in the military was marked by triumphs and setbacks. She was deployed on several tours, earning commendations for her service, but also witnessing firsthand the institutionalized biases that shaped military operations and the treatment of soldiers of color. She began to speak out more openly about the need for change, using her platform to advocate for the creation of mentorship programs and leadership pipelines for marginalized groups. Despite the challenges, Amara's impact was undeniable. Her reputation as a leader and reformer began to spread beyond the military circles, and she soon found herself invited to national discussions about racial justice, equality, and reform. Yet, as much as she achieved, Amara remained grounded by her roots, the very community that had shaped her values and fueled her drive. It was this same unwavering commitment to justice that would soon bring her to the courthouse, facing a judge who had no idea just how much she had already changed the world. The fine she had received wasn't just an injustice. It was a sign that the fight for equality, both in the military and beyond, was far from over, and Amara was ready to take it on, head first. Amara Simmons stood quietly in the courtroom, her military uniform a testament to years of service, sacrifice, and unwavering dedication to reform. She had faced far greater challenges in her life than this, dismantling racial inequality within the military, advocating for systemic change and justice, and pushing for a more equitable world. Yet, this moment felt strangely insignificant, almost surreal. She was being fined for a minor parking violation, an error that felt too small to warrant the attention it was about to receive. Judge Nathaniel Brooks, an experienced but aging figure, sat at the bench. His reputation was built on years of impartiality and stern rulings, but his biases, unseen and unacknowledged, clouded his perception in this case. He looked down at Amara's file, seeing only a black woman standing before him, and in that instant, his decision was made. She wasn't someone he knew, someone whose life had made a difference. To him, she was just another defendant, a woman who had made a simple mistake, a mistake that deserved punishment. The courtroom was filled with the soft rustle of papers and the hum of low murmurs as Amara's attorney presented their case. It was clear that this fine was excessive, far beyond the typical penalty for such an infraction. There was a sense of injustice in the room, but it was subtle. Amara remained silent, not out of fear or hesitation, but because she had learned long ago that her voice often wasn't heard when she spoke in frustration. In these moments, her calmness was her weapon, even if it didn't always change the outcome. Judge Brooks listened carefully to her attorney's arguments, but his mind was already made up. He glanced at Amara one more time before bringing down his gavel with a sharp crack, announcing a fine far higher than was customary. His voice, firm but dismissive, told Amara that the decision was final. He didn't see her as someone capable of impacting the systems he worked within. He saw her only as a number on a docket. Outside, reporters gathered, eager for any tidbit of news. Amara felt their eyes on her as she left the courthouse. She could already hear the questions, the whispers that would follow her every move. Who was she? Why had she been treated this way? They wouldn't know yet. They wouldn't understand that the woman they were looking at wasn't just any person who had made a mistake in a city parking lot. She was Amara Simmons, the very woman who had spent years challenging the military and justice system, pushing for real, lasting change in the face of resistance. What Judge Brooks didn't know was that this was just the beginning. This seemingly small interaction was going to set off a ripple effect that would change everything. The fine wasn't just about parking. It was a symptom of a much larger issue. The systems that existed to maintain power, often at the expense of the very people working to change them. And Amara was about to show the world that she was not a casualty of the system, but one of its most formidable challengers. As the news of Amara Simmons's courtroom encounter spread, the story of the unjust fine began to take on a life of its own. The initial reports described her as just another citizen caught in a bureaucratic snafu, a parking violation gone wrong. But soon, as journalists dug deeper, they uncovered a much more compelling narrative. Amara's name, which had once been buried among the countless everyday figures in the world, began to rise above the noise. Her life story, far from ordinary, became an inspiring testament to the power of resilience and reform. The media began to dig into her background, and they quickly discovered that Amara was no ordinary woman. She wasn't just a military officer. She was a pioneer, an architect of systemic change within the U.S. Armed Forces. She had worked tirelessly for years to ensure that black soldiers were given fair treatment, that women had equal opportunities in leadership positions, and that the military's policies reflected a commitment to racial and gender equity. Her work on military reform had garnered recognition across various platforms, from government agencies to nonprofit organizations, but it was her advocacy for racial justice that made her a symbol of hope and empowerment. But the media's scrutiny wasn't just focused on her accomplishments. They highlighted the glaring injustice of the fine imposed by Judge Nathaniel Brooks, a figure whose public profile had, until now, been defined by his long tenure on the bench. People began to ask questions. Why had the judge issued such a severe penalty? Was this an isolated incident, or was it part of a larger, systemic problem of racial inequality in the legal system? The more Amara's story was told, the more it became clear that her encounter with the law wasn't just an unfortunate mishap. It was an illustration of the very biases and inequalities that she had spent her career fighting against. What had seemed like a minor inconvenience was, in reality, a symbol of a much larger issue. Social media exploded with hashtags like #JusticeForAmara and #NBASynthicOurts. Activists, politicians, and ordinary citizens began to rally behind her. The hashtag quickly went viral, and people from all walks of life shared their own experiences of discrimination in the justice system, military, and other institutions. Amara's case was now a focal point for national discussions on racial bias, injustice, and the need for reform at every level of government and society. For Amara, the viral attention was overwhelming, but she wasn't surprised. She had long understood that the work she did, the risks she took, and the reforms she pushed for weren't always going to be popular. She had been prepared for backlash, even from the very institutions she sought to change. But what she hadn't anticipated was that this small, seemingly inconsequential moment, a fine for a parking violation, would propel her into the center of a national conversation. Judge Brooks, meanwhile, had no idea what he was about to learn about the woman he had just fined. His perception of Amara, built on nothing more than a quick glance at her case file, was about to be shattered. He had no idea that the woman he had dismissed so easily was about to change his entire understanding of power, justice, and the systems he thought he knew so well. As the media frenzy surrounding Amara Simmons grew, the attention quickly turned from her minor parking violation to the larger story of who she really was. The narrative that initially seemed to paint her as a victim of bureaucracy began to shift dramatically. Amara was no ordinary woman caught in a routine legal dispute. She was an accomplished leader, a trailblazer whose work in military reform and justice advocacy had already left an indelible mark on the systems she was now challenging. The more the press uncovered about her, the more the public was captivated by Amara's background. Articles and interviews highlighted her pioneering efforts to fight racial and gender inequality in the military, her tireless work for policy changes that gave marginalized groups a voice, and her bold stance against institutionalized racism. Amara had spent years advocating for structural reforms that would allow people of color to rise through the ranks in the military, pushing for equal representation, better treatment, and an end to discriminatory practices. Journalists dug deep into her career, uncovering her role in launching initiatives like leadership development programs for underrepresented groups, the implementation of anti-bias training within military units, and her work in reforming the way military justice treated Black service members. The more the public learned about Amara, the more her name became synonymous with a tireless pursuit of justice, both inside and outside the military. But it wasn't just her history of reform that caught the public's attention. It was also the glaring contrast between her reputation and the way Judge Nathaniel Brooks had treated her. In every interview, Amara remained composed, speaking about the fine with a calm resolve. She didn't let the situation define her. Instead, she focused on the larger issue of racial bias and inequality. Her ability to rise above the indignity of the fine only amplified the public's admiration. Meanwhile, Judge Brooks, who had once seen Amara as just another defendant, found himself inundated with calls from reporters eager to learn more about the woman whose case had captured the nation's attention. He began to feel the weight of the backlash. His office was flooded with letters and emails criticizing his decision, some questioning his impartiality, others demanding an explanation for why he had imposed such an unusually high fine. Out of curiosity, and perhaps a growing sense of accountability, Judge Brooks began to look into Amara's background. What he found was staggering. The woman he had dismissed so casually in his courtroom was not just an average citizen. She was a force of nature, someone whose contributions to military and justice reform had already reshaped policies in ways that would impact generations to come. He read about her leadership roles, the impact she'd had on military policy, and her outspoken advocacy for racial justice in the legal system. It hit him with full force. He had made a monumental error. The more Judge Brooks learned about Amara, the more he felt the weight of his ignorance. He had underestimated her, not just as a defendant, but as a symbol of change. His decision to fine her had been a mistake, but it was more than that. It was a reflection of the biases he hadn't realized he carried. In private, Judge Brooks was forced to confront his actions. His pride was bruised, but the truth was undeniable. He had misjudged Amara, and in doing so, had added fuel to the very fire she had been trying to extinguish. The fine, in hindsight, seemed like nothing more than a misstep in a much larger battle, one that Amara was now more determined than ever to fight. Judge Nathaniel Brooks sat alone in his chambers, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. The courtroom, where he had issued the fine just days earlier, felt distant now, as if that moment in time had been something outside of himself. The media coverage of Amara Simmons had exploded, and the more he learned about her, the more uncomfortable he felt. He had presided over countless cases in his career, but this one was different. He had failed to see the true significance of the woman standing before him that day. He had failed to see her as more than just another defendant. Brooks's mind churned as he sifted through the information that had come his way. Amara Simmons wasn't just an officer in the military. She was a leader, a reformer, a woman who had devoted her life to dismantling the very biases he had unintentionally upheld. The articles, the interviews, the reports detailing her years of service and advocacy, it all began to settle heavily in his conscience. He had judged her based on a superficial glance at her case file and an outdated notion of authority. In his mind, she was just another black woman in his courtroom, another minor infraction, another routine ruling. But that had been a mistake. He thought back to her calm, unshaken presence in the courtroom. Amara hadn't raised her voice in anger or demanded special treatment. She hadn't played the victim or sought sympathy. Instead, she had held her ground, as if she knew, in some way, that this moment was bigger than just the fine, that it was a reflection of something much deeper. The fine had been a symbol of something far more profound, the very systems of inequality she had spent her life trying to reform. Brooks's face flushed as he remembered how dismissive he had been, how quick he had been to impose a harsh penalty on someone he hadn't bothered to understand. His error wasn't just a failure of judgment in this case, it was a reflection of the blind spots he carried. Shaped by years of unchallenged authority and a system that favored him. Amara's case wasn't just about her. It was about the broader issue of racial bias in the legal system, and he had played an active role in perpetuating that bias, however inadvertently. He thought about the backlash, how people had rallied behind her, demanding justice not just for Amara, but for all those who faced similar treatment in the courts. It was clear to him now, this wasn't just a story about a woman getting a fine. It was about a moment in time that had exposed a much larger problem. Determined to make things right, Judge Brooks reached out to Amara. He didn't know exactly what to expect from the conversation, but he knew he had to speak to her directly. He had to apologize. More than that, he needed to understand the fight she had been waging for so long, and perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way he could make amends. His pride as a judge had been wounded, but in its place, a new sense of responsibility had emerged. The truth was inescapable. He could no longer be a passive participant in a system that allowed inequality to persist. As he drafted the letter to Amara, Brooks knew that this was only the beginning. He was taking the first step toward acknowledging his own biases, and perhaps in doing so, he would begin to understand the broader work of justice and reform that Amara had been fighting for all along. Amara's phone buzzed constantly in the days following the court case. The fine had become a catalyst, igniting a wildfire of support for her cause. What had started as a minor legal issue had quickly escalated into a national conversation about racial justice, bias in the legal system, and the deep-rooted inequality that pervaded not only the courts, but also the military and other public institutions. It seemed as though Amara's every word and action was now under a microscope, but she remained focused on the larger fight at hand. She knew this moment was an opportunity, an opening to demand real systemic change. Her voice had been amplified, not just by the injustice she faced, but by the thousands of people who stood with her, eager to see reform. As the days passed, Amara harnessed the growing momentum, using the attention to launch a national campaign calling for a comprehensive review of military and judicial practices. Her platform, built on years of advocacy, was now elevated by the fine that had so quickly become a symbol of all that was wrong with the system. Amara appeared on talk shows, spoke at rallies, and wrote op-eds. Every platform she took, she used to highlight the need for change, not just in the military or the legal system, but in every corner of American society where injustice and discrimination persisted. She called for the establishment of independent oversight committees to review judges' decisions and military policies, pushing for deeper, more substantive conversations about racial bias and its pervasive effects on people of color. The media coverage was relentless, but it was also powerful. People who had never heard of Amara Simmons before were now learning about her accomplishments, her years of pushing for diverse leadership in the military, her work to reshape policies that disproportionately impacted Black service members, and her fight to end systemic inequalities that affected both military personnel and civilians alike. Amara had become a voice for a movement, and the fine, though unjust, had put her at the forefront of that change. Judge Nathaniel Brooks, having come to understand the error of his decision, publicly acknowledged his mistake and apologized to Amara. His statement, though humbling, was met with mixed reactions. Many saw it as a step in the right direction, but others believed that his apology, while important, didn't go far enough. The public demanded more, not just symbolic gestures, but real, tangible change. The fine had exposed something much larger than a single misjudgment in the courtroom. It had revealed the cracks in the systems that upheld such injustices. Together, Amara and Judge Brooks began collaborating on initiatives aimed at addressing the very issues that had led to her fine. They called for a nationwide review of judicial practices to ensure fairness and transparency in sentencing. Amara used her platform to hold the justice system accountable, but also to encourage reform-minded judges like Brooks to engage with the communities they served. She urged military leaders to be more proactive in their diversity efforts and to confront the systemic biases within the armed forces. By the time the first of many reform bills was introduced, Amara's campaign had reached a fever pitch. The movement was no longer just about her. It was about all those who had been silenced, ignored, or unjustly punished by a system that had been too slow to evolve. The wave of change had begun, and Amara Simmons was no longer just a military officer or a justice advocate. She had become a force for transformation in every sense. As the campaign gained momentum, Amara could feel the power of what was unfolding. It was no longer about the fine. It was about rewriting the rules of fairness and equity for generations to come. Months passed, and the ripple effects of Amara Simmons's encounter with the justice system grew into a full-blown movement. What had started as an unjust fine for a minor parking infraction had become a transformative force for change, not just within the military or the courtroom, but across the entire fabric of American society. The story of a black woman challenging the status quo had struck a chord with people from all walks of life. And now, Amara was more than a figurehead of resistance. She was the catalyst for a much-needed overhaul of broken systems. Amara's campaign for reform gained traction with powerful political leaders backing her call for change. Bills designed to increase judicial accountability, address racial bias, and ensure equal treatment in the military gained momentum in Congress. Amara had long recognized that real transformation wouldn't happen overnight, but she could feel the winds shifting. The voices of those who had been silenced by injustice, those who had lived with the consequences of systemic oppression, were being heard for the first time. At the same time, Judge Nathaniel Brooks, who had publicly apologized for his initial decision, found himself navigating a new chapter in his life. He had been forever changed by his encounter with Amara and the ensuing public outcry. No longer just a figure of authority in the courtroom, he had become a symbol of the potential for growth and accountability within the judicial system. He began working with Amara on initiatives to reform how judges were trained, focusing not just on the law but on how to navigate biases that often went unnoticed. Together, they spearheaded workshops for judges nationwide, teaching them to be more self-aware and intentional in their decision-making. Amara's advocacy also pushed the military to examine its internal structures more closely. A national initiative was launched to promote diversity and inclusion, offering leadership programs specifically designed for marginalized groups. Amara became a key advisor, consulting with military leaders on how to dismantle ingrained biases and create a culture of respect and opportunity for all service members. Her efforts led to the establishment of mentorship programs for women and people of color, aimed at increasing representation in leadership positions. The work wasn't easy. There were setbacks, and the road to full reform was long, but Amara never wavered. She was driven by the knowledge that her fight was part of something larger than herself. Her influence spread beyond the military and the justice system, inspiring activists, educators, and lawmakers to take a hard look at the inequities woven into the fabric of American society. Years later, when people looked back on the changes that had reshaped the legal and military landscapes, they saw Amara Simmons as one of the primary architects of that transformation. Her name became synonymous with courage, resilience, and justice. Her legacy was not just the policies she helped shape or the systems she helped reform. It was the hope she instilled in others, the belief that one individual could indeed spark an era of change. Amara, now widely regarded as a champion of justice, could finally see the world she had dreamed of taking shape, one where fairness, equality, and opportunity were no longer just ideals, but reality for all. And in her heart, she knew that the true victory wasn't just in the changes she had helped bring about. It was in the countless others who had found their own voices and together had begun to change the world.